Director of Education here at the museum, and on behalf of the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, I want to say welcome. We're delighted that so many of you have come in from the warm day outside to the cool auditorium to hear our back by popular demand Colm Toibín this afternoon. I don't think we need to rely on the superstition of third time's a charm, but I feel that we're in for a treat. I think he's feeling very frisky this afternoon. So be cautious with your questions. This afternoon, Parallel Stories continues to explore loosely and broadly the theme found in translation, this time through the sinister mastery and magic of award-winning author Colm Toibín, who, far more than translating, seems to inhabit the consciousness, the very soul of his characters, from a young Irish immigrant to an aging, resentful mother of Christ, to most recently in his new novel, House of Names, the violent, dysfunctional, heart-stopping rage, passion, and betrayal of Clytemnestra and her children. In his retelling of the tale, Toibín's reverence for the ancient text is perfectly married to his modern sensibility, making for a subtle, lyric, tense, and measured dance between action and restraint, between faith and the leftover language of prayer. As he shares passages and process with us this afternoon, we may find, as we reimagine with him, the story of a family at war with itself. Connections, perhaps disturbing, to our own time, to the language of the Irish poets, Yeats and Joyce and Wilde, and to his own earlier stories. As he has said of this novel, I saw it as events happening in a single space, almost like a town, a place full of secrets and whispers and rumors. Please join me in welcoming back to this stage, Colm Toibín.
Very much for coming. It's a beautiful day. In Ireland, if it was a day like this, nobody would come in. But in Ireland, it would be just one day a year you get like this. You get, when you're here, and you get other days like this as well, which isn't just one day. And I want to begin by making connections between what happened in Ireland in the creation of Irish independence and what happened in Greece. I want to invoke a certain moment at the beginning of the 20th century when Lady Gregory, who was one of the founders of the Irish National Theatre, is attempting to defend herself when she's having dinner with friends of hers who are anti-Irish or pro-British, and asking her why is she bothering with this business of trying to start a theatre in Ireland, or why is she trying to get out of the peasants in the fields writing down their stories, and why is she translating from the Irish, and why is she not in London where she should be at dinner parties? And Lady Gregory was born in 1852. She married a man who was 35 years older than she, and she was a widow at 40, and she lived for 40 more years. So in 1892 she was a widow, and she owned a house in the west of Ireland called Cool Park, a big house with a big estate, and she lived a great deal of the time in London, where she was invited everywhere and was intensely popular. She was a great friend of Henry James's, for example. And really she could have spent the next 40 years just moving between her estate in the west of Ireland, collecting her rents, and London, and she could have travelled, she could have lived for pleasure. But she decided, really within a year or two of becoming a widow, to devote the rest of her life to the cause of Ireland. And when she was asked if she was working for Home Rule, she was very canny, she was always very careful in answering questions. She said, no, I'm not working for Home Rule. Meaning Home Rule was considered the most dangerous thing, because Ireland would be the first country to move away from the British Empire. She said, no, I'm not working for Home Rule, I'm working for after Home Rule. And then she would say very softly, my aim is to add dignity to Ireland. And so in the 1890s, she began to learn Irish. And if you go into the bird collection at the New York Public Library, where her papers are, you can see her with her copybook writing out the words, thaw and bow, ik dal, gudi, the cow is going to the well, and she's writing out every word, writing below, exactly how the grammar works. She was brought up in a household where there was a great amount of Bible reading, so she knew the Bible in English very, very well. So she got a Bible in Irish, and she began to compare them and learn words and grammar from one to the other. When she needed to know something, of course, all she had to do was send out to one of her tenants or one of her workers, because they spoke Irish, to come in and tell her what a certain word meant or what a certain phrase meant. She goes to the Aran Islands in the west, off the west of Ireland on her own. She lives in an ordinary cottage with people just listening to every word, trying to work out what these people are saying. And she realizes something that is going to have enormous political implications now, which is that some people on her own estate and on the islands and on the coast of the west of Ireland are in possession of stories that are thousands of years old, that have been passed on from generation to generation orally. And she also realizes that these stories have also been written down, and versions of them are in Trinity College in Dublin, in the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin, and in Oxford, in various libraries. And what happened was that Christianity came to Ireland in 432. By the 6th century, Christianity has formed into a set of monasteries all over Ireland, and the monasteries have enough money and leisure for certain monks to devote themselves entirely to writing stories down. And these stories, in other words, they go out, they find a story, they write the story down, and someone else makes a copy of it. So we have, in those collections in Ireland, stories written down in the 6th century, 7th century, copies made in the 8th and the 9th centuries. And these, of course, became a great subject for antiquarian scholars in the 18th century, but also especially in the 19th century, who would make very scholarly editions of them. But what Lady Gregory realized was that if you could connect the poor of Ireland, I mean the people who were emigrating, people who had suffered from famine, to an ancient glory, to an Ireland that had a great literature, that you would then give the people who were living in this state of poverty a sort of sense of their own importance, a sense of dignity. So she explained to these people who said, what's the connection between these people who are living they're almost illiterate, and they're living in these tiny little cottages, to some ancient glory. She said it's exactly the same relationship as people living in Greece to ancient Greece. In other words, modern Irish, the language, is as close to ancient, or to Old Irish, as modern Greek is to ancient Greek. And anyone listening to this, of course, would think, oh, because of course it was that idea of belonging to some ancient culture that gave Greece a sense of its own nationhood at the beginning of the 19th century and allowed it to remove itself from the Ottoman Empire and attempt to form a sort of nation, to forge a nation, or to invent a nation, or reinvent a nation, or imagine a nation. And this was dynamite, in fact. This was stronger than dynamite, because if you could get Irish nationalism working with the idea that the reason for removing ourselves from the empire was not for economic reasons, although perhaps economic reasons were there too, but for cultural reasons. In other words, that we are an older culture than you are. Our literature is, you may have Shakespeare and Marlowe, but we actually have pre-Christian mythology that is older than Beowulf, and not only is it older, but it was written down, and not only was it written down, but it was also passed along orally, and so that this became an important moment in actually trying to revitalize or recreate or reimagine an Ireland at the end of the 19th century, which would eventually lead to the 1916 rebellion and to Irish independence in 1922, that, in other words, this whole idea of translating, of making new editions of these ancient stories. So in 1898, in the west of Ireland, in somebody's house, Lady Gregory also met the poet W.B. Yeats. And he was a floppy-haired young poet. He was living a lot in London. And Arthur Symonds, who was in the room, said, "Oh, when she cast her terrible eye on him, I knew she would keep him." Lady Gregory was very determined, and she was 13 years older than Yeats. She was a widow. She had this big house. Her only child, her son, was living he was living mainly in London. So from 1898 until 1917, when he finally married. So for those 19 years, W.B. Yeats came to Coole Park for 4 or 5 months of the year in the summer. And he had the master bedroom, he sat at the head of the table, and he had the run of the library. And not only that, but Lady Gregory would take him out every day to introduce him to her tenants. Now, she was very good at collecting rents from these tenants, as well as collecting stories from them. I mean, she was very good at holding a number of different positions at the same time. You know, in Dublin, she was the great woman who was collecting folklore. Back on the estate, she was the woman collecting rents. And but she would bring him out and introduce him to these people and translate for him. And of course, at one moment, her son comes back from London after some of these years, and he goes down to the cellars and he looks to see that all the wonderful wine that his father had put down in the cellars is all gone. So, where's my father's wine? Because he is the inheritor, you know, he's the heir. And I was like, oh, Yeats drank it all. And so there's a letter in the public library from Lady Gregory to Yeats saying, when you come next year, could you please bring your own wine? Because you drunk all of ours. But in other words, she rescued him. I mean, he was a penniless poet living in London, working as a journalist and doing his best to write his poems. But she rescued him in a certain way so that most of his great poems of those 2 decades were actually written in her house in those 5 months, because he would take notes in the winter, write down lines, think of ideas, and then he'd have all of these days with all of these servants in this beautiful house in the west of Ireland. And what they realised was that the thing they didn't have, that the Greeks had, was a theatre. That there was no tradition of the theatre in Ireland. There just simply hadn't been enough money. And what they thought they would do was that they would invent one. And so the Abbey Theatre, the National Theatre, which is still there, was founded in 1904. And the patent, because it was very difficult, you couldn't just build a new theatre. You know, it was very carefully controlled. The patent allowed them only to write new plays. They could only produce new plays, and no one thought they would be important because there were no new plays. Who was writing new plays? And they fired up every young writer in the country to produce new work for them. They got the plays of John Millington Synge, such as The Playboy of the Western World, or Riders of the Sea. Later on, they got the plays of Sean Casey, and they produced them in their theatre. But I want to go back just one step earlier, where obviously before this, I was talking about the idea of, oh yes, sorry, one more thing I want to say. That the thing that Lady Gregory had that Yeats really wanted, besides a big house, was he wanted a typewriter, and she had one. And so they began to type, you know, she could type for him, but he thought she had no literary talent. He was asked by a London publisher if he would make a popular translation of what's called the Táin, which is I think the great piece of Irish mythological writing, the story of Cuchulainn and all his warriors. And there are a number of translations now. There's one in Penguin Classics done by Kieran Carson. There's another one by Thomas Kinsella. But at this time, there had only been scholarly, dry, footnoted versions in, you know, for scholars, written by scholars. And what this London publisher wanted was a popular version that the world could read. And Yeats just said he didn't have time. And Lady Gregory said, well, she'd like to do it. And Yeats didn't think she could. But then when he saw her working, he realised that she all the time had this literary talent. and a talent as a translator to translate these very difficult texts into a modern vernacular that could be read by everybody. For example, this book, which she finally published in the early years of the 20th century, became a bestseller, was read by the President of the United States, and really changed the whole idea of Irish people in America, where people thought they just came from dreadful poverty, from famine, from misery, with a whiff of rebellion and revolution about them. So that you could never be sure that your maid at night wasn't off at some secret meeting about something or other. Whereas this, the idea that your maid or your barman or people who were digging and who were building the bridges and the tunnels actually came from an ancient race that had this extraordinary culture that was pre-Christian, that was sort of intact in the sense that now it had been translated into this text that everybody was reading. So it became all the fashion to in these years, the early years of the 20th century, when the periphery was moving to the center. Just remember that in Paris, Picasso is looking for African masks. Composers are looking for folk music. Everyone is looking for a Breton fisherman, or Hungarian folk music, or Spanish folk music, or African sources. So too Ireland became immensely fashionable in London. I mean, the idea of Ireland after all the trouble of the dynamiters, suddenly in the early years of the 20th century becoming a fashionable thing to be Irish is sort of almost unimaginable. But part of the inspiration for this comes from the idea that in Europe, the other country that had managed to connect itself to its ancient past, and by doing that had become an independent state, was Greece. And obviously the archaeology then is also really important, because if you could connect the landscape itself to a much earlier culture, that would then give you a sense of the sheer richness of, for example, Gaelic or Celtic culture. And among the people who became fascinated by both translation and by archaeology were the parents of Oscar Wilde. Sir William Wilde became an amateur archaeologist and antiquarian, and he wrote books about features in the landscape. Oscar Wilde's mother made translations from ancient Irish texts as well, and they held court in Dublin. And what's strange about the parents of Oscar Wilde, say in the 1860s, 1870s, and Lady Gregory later on, was that these were Irish Protestants. These were people who spoke English. But what they began to have was a sort of gnarled relationship or a gnarled allegiance to England. In other words, that while all their power came from London, they began to use that power towards reinventing or reimagining Ireland, towards making an Ireland of the future. And the Wildes educated their son Oscar. He went to Trinity College, where he studied classics, and he went to Oxford, where he further studied classics, but especially Greek, because of course the whole idea was to step over the Roman, because the Romans had built an empire. And the empire, the British Empire, had in a way based itself on the idea of the Roman Empire, whereas the Greeks would bring you back one step further, where you say, in England, they're Romans, in Ireland, we're Greeks. And Oscar Wilde actually went to Greece as a student, and he wrote, for example, in an essay in 1887 about Euripides. For though Euripides has not the Titan strength of Aeschylus, that Michelangelo of the Athenian stage, nor the self-restraint and artistic reserve of Sophocles, yet he has qualities that are absolutely and entirely his own. His broad acceptance of the actual facts of life, his extraordinary psychological insight into the workings of the human mind, his keen dramatic instinct for scene and situation, and his freedom from theological prejudice make him the most interesting of studies. He was a poet, a philosopher, and a playwright. The most modern of all the ancients. There is something of Browning in him, and not a little of Dumas feel. If he broke with the tradition of the Greek stage, at least he made he made Menander inevitable. If he sets passion above perfection, he is for that reason all the more human. Though he dissects life, he never desecrates it. And the mere fact that the dramatic critics of the day spoke of him as an immoral writer shows how ethical was the impulse that stirred him. Which it seems to be Wilde writing about himself, in fact. He saw indeed that men and women as they are more interesting than men and women as they ought to be. He never tried to make humanity real by exaggerating its proportions. He cared little for giants or for gods. The sorrows of mortals touched him more than all the gladness of Olympus. And so that this idea then that it wasn't just that you were nobody if you weren't Irish in London, but if you were Irish, you invoked the Greek constantly. And you, for example, W.B. Yeats began to translate the Oedipus plays to be performed in the Abbey Theatre as new Irish work. But in his book, The Green Helmet and Other Poems, written in 1910, Yeats invokes Homer quite a lot in poems. And also, as the revolutionary spirit is building, Yeats has a particular problem, which is that he's in love with Maud Gonne. Now, being in love with Maud Gonne was difficult because she was never in love with you. And she was tremendously beautiful and very rich, and marriage didn't quite suit her. You know, and she was very good at making revolutionary speeches, but not so good, say, at making breakfast in the morning or overseeing a household. And so on one side of his life, W.B. Yeats had Lady Gregory. She was terribly controlling and sensible and strategic. On the other side, he had Maud Gonne, who was in love with her, and she was, I suppose, a die-hard revolutionary, and she was always flitting around the country making big speeches. And so he wanted to write a poem about this. And the poem he wrote is called No Second Troy, where he saw her as an example of Helen of Troy, someone whose very beauty would cause men to go to war. And this was something that he wanted to dramatize in this short poem called No Second Troy. Why should I blame her that she filled my days with misery, or that she would of late have taught to ignorant men most violent ways, or hurled the little streets upon the great? Had they but courage equal to desire, what could have made her peaceful, with a mind that nobleness made simple as a fire, with beauty like a Titan bow, a kind that is not natural in an age like this, being high and solitary and most stern? Why, what could she have done, being what she is? Was there another Troy for her to burn? And of course, in 1916, this book comes out 6 years before the rebellion. There was indeed another Troy for her to burn, and her husband, John McBride, was actually executed at the end. I mean, the marriage didn't last long, but nonetheless, she had been married to him. He was executed at the 1916 rebellion. So there, in fact, was another Troy for her to burn, and that Troy was Dublin. And in the middle of this, of course, who's watching all this like a little hawk, is James Joyce. He's born in 1882, so in other words, he's 20 years old, say, when Lady Gregory publishes her first translations. And he's a literary young man, he's writing poetry, he's producing his first book, Dubliners, some of the stories are appearing, then Portrait of the Artist as a young man. And he's particularly skilled as a writer, but he's also particularly skilled as someone to bite the hand, any hand that feeds him. For example, at one moment, Lady Gregory decides that he should be introduced to a literary editor so he can write book reviews, so he can make some money. And the literary editor says, well, oh great, well, here's a book for you. It's a new book of translations by Lady Gregory. It's her folklore collection. Joyce says, oh great. So he takes it home and he writes a big attack on the book. He refers to her, the people she's taken the folklore from, as actually quite senile and he really wants nothing to do with the movement which she and W. Yeats are building, the movement in the theatre and the movement in translation, and the attempt to sort of revitalise reimagining Ireland that I've mentioned. But having finished Dubliners, which he talks about being a chapter in the sort of moral history of his country, being written in a style of scrupulous meanness, which is it's his term for the style of Dubliners, and then the autobiographical novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He really wants to write the novel that will end all novel writing, and he wants to make the novel intensely personal. It's to be called Ulysses, but it will all happen in one single day, the 16th of June 1904. It's personal because that is the first day that he walked out with the woman with whom he would spend the rest of his life, who was Nora Barnacle. And it will honour that day. But in order to find a structure for the book, how do you find a structure for a book that happens in a single day in what is effectively a provincial city? He will go to Homer. In other words, he will go to the Odyssey, and he will make his Ulysses. He will, as he's working, have a plan where even the smallest detail of the novel Ulysses is based on a moment in the Odyssey. He will have working titles for chapters such as Cyclops and such as Circe for various chapters of his book. In other words, the structure he will use will be a Greek structure. Yeats then, once the state is founded, realizes that he's become respectable. He's won the Nobel Prize. He's a senator in the new state. And he was a great disturber of the peace. He didn't ever enjoy that moment where he was the most respectable person in the room. And a number of young men and women had founded a revolutionary magazine. This is after the revolution, to publish sort of revolutionary literature. And Yeats writes a poem. He publishes the poem first in America, just to be safe, and then publishes it on the front page of this magazine, which is to be called Tomorrow. It's referred to by various people as Senator Yeats's filthy swan song. But he has been watching very carefully what's happened in Russia. He's also what's been happening in Italy, and the sort of cataclysms after the First World War. And again, in order to find a metaphor for this, or a way of dealing with it, and a way of seeing into the future how one single act of violence can lead to many other ones, and many other ones in turn, he invokes the myth of Leda and the Swan in this strange sonnet, which is almost in its own way a way of also, as Joyce wanted to write a novel to end all novels, this sonnet wants to put an end to the Petrarchan sonnet, the Shakespearean sonnet, the idea of the sonnet as a sweet assenting form. This sonnet is filled with violence, and it could not be more clotted, and there could not be more, there could not be less resolution at the end of it. It ends with a question rather than a rhyming couplet. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill. He holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Being so caught up, so mastered by the brute blood of the air, did she put on his knowledge with his power before the indifferent beak could let her drop. And that line in the middle of this sonnet, and Agamemnon dead, of course, Clytemnestra is also the daughter of Leda. And this leads me to this book called House of Names. Really, sometimes if you're writing a novel, what you're looking for is the blurred figure in the picture. And for any version of this story, we all know Electra. You know, because she has appeared in so many versions, and she's got so much to say, and she's in such a rage, and her mother is really in the background. But I had never read a play, which is a late play by Euripides called Iphigenia in Aulis. I presume all of you know it, but I didn't. And when I went to it, I was reading those new translations by Anne Carson, and then with that wonderful introduction, and then I went back to the Robert Fagles, and I looked at the introduction. So I wish, if that title, Iphigenia in Aulis, perhaps in Greek that title sounds wonderful, but in English, I mean, I wish Euripides had called it something else. I mean, Electra is such a great title. If you were passing a theatre and you saw Electra was on, you would go in and see it. But it associates with electricity, But Iphigenia, you don't even have to say it. Iphigenia in Aulis. So, well, I'll go with that maybe next week. But it is a revelation. And it really is the most complex. I think Oscar Wilde is absolutely right in the way he writes about Euripides, that this text gives you a sense of what Clytemnestra was put through. That in other words, she was lured to the camp by her husband, who wanted the winds to change. The gods had said the winds could only change if their daughter Iphigenia was sacrificed. And he lured his wife and his daughter, and they brought the boy, their son, Orestes as well, saying there was going to be a wedding, that she was going to marry, that he was going to marry his daughter to Achilles, the warrior. It was going to be a great occasion. So the seamstresses all worked, everyone was ready, all the clothes were ready. It was going to be a great ceremony. And instead, he didn't. In my book, he didn't even have the courage to tell her when he meets her. He plays sword fighting with the boy. He hugs his daughter. It's a perfect picture of happiness. He's laughing. Agamemnon. He doesn't have the courage to tell her what he has in mind. And I think, like people, perhaps now, it's a contemporary idea as much as it's an ancient idea. He knew what he should do, and he knew what he was going to do, and they were different. That he knew that he should not sacrifice his daughter, but the men wanted him to do this, and so he was going to do this. So I think that maybe there's a city on the East Coast where people are still living in this world of what they know what they should do. And they we can applaud and think that maybe we all do that sometimes in our lives as well. But anyway, let's not go into that. I mean, what she decides to do in the aftermath of having her daughter sacrificed is she decides she's going to get him when he comes home. And she plans it meticulously. She gets a lover, Aegisthus, and he helps her. And the plan is that when Agamemnon comes home from the wars, and he comes with Cassandra, who's quite beautiful, and Clytemnestra sees them both, but she has everything ready. She's going to kill him. And she's going to get him at that moment, I think, when men are most vulnerable, when you've got one foot in the bath, and the other quite not in the bath, and she gets him. And anyway, this is the opening of the book, where one of the problems with violence is that once it starts, it's impossible to put it back into its bottle. That when I was working as a reporter, for example, in Northern Ireland, I would notice that there were so many times when one killing seemed to be a retaliation for a previous one. You could never see anything in isolation. And the killing the following week was in retaliation for that. And then it would be something much worse done a week later. And all of it would be connected from one thing to the other. And to try and get it to stop was the hardest. And so she is fired up with the idea of what she's just done. And it's almost clear from her tone that she's only starting. Once she has begun to kill, she's going to go on doing that. And even though later on in this chapter we see that she's almost justified in what she does, that she really has been fooled and badly treated. But nonetheless, once she starts, she thinks like this. I have been acquainted with the smell of death, the sickly, sugary smell that wafted in the wind towards the rooms in this palace. It is easy now for me to feel peaceful and content. I spend my morning looking at the sky and the changing light. The bird song begins to rise as the world fills with its own pleasures. And then as day wanes, the sound too wanes and fades. I watch as the shadows lengthen. So much has slipped away, but the smell of death lingers. Maybe the smell has entered my body and been welcomed there like an old friend come to visit. The smell of fear and panic. The smell is here like the very air is here. It returns in the same way as light in the morning returns. It is my constant companion. It has put life into my eyes, eyes that grew dull with waiting, but are not dull now, eyes that are alive now with brightness. I gave orders that the bodies should remain in the open under the sun a day or two, until the sweetness gave way to stench. And I liked the flies that came, their little bodies, brave, buzzing after their feast, upset by the continuing hunger they felt in themselves, a hunger I had come to know too, come to appreciate. We're all hungry now. Food merely whets our appetite, it sharpens our teeth. Meat makes us ravenous for more meat, as death is ravenous for more death. Murder makes us ravenous, fills the soul with satisfaction that is fierce and then luscious enough to create a taste for further satisfaction. A knife piercing the soft flesh under the ear with intimacy and precision, and then moving across the throat as soundlessly as the sun moves across the sky, but with greater speed and zeal, and then his dark blood flowing with the same inevitable hush as dark night falls on familiar things. I had spies to tell me when my husband would come back. Men lit each fire that gave the news to further hills where other men lit fires to alert me. It was the fire that brought the news, not the gods. Among the gods now there is no one who offers me assistance or oversees my actions or knows my mind. There is no one among the gods to whom I appeal. I live alone in the shivering, solitary knowledge that the time of the gods has passed. I'm praying to no gods. I'm alone among those here because I do not pray and will not pray again. Instead, I will speak in ordinary whispers. I will speak in words that come from the world, and those words will be filled with regret for what has been lost. I will make sounds like prayers, but prayers that have no source and no destination, not even a human one, since my daughter is dead and cannot hear. I know, as no one else knows, that the gods are distant. They have other concerns. They care about human desires and antics in the same way that I care about the leaves of a tree. I know the leaves are there. They wither and grow again and wither as people come and live and then are replaced by others like them. There's nothing I can do to help them or prevent their withering. I do not deal with their desires. I wish to stand here now and laugh, hear me tittering, and then howling with mirth at the idea that the gods allowed my husband to win his war, that they inspired every plan he worked out and every move he made, that they knew his cloudy moods in the morning and the strange and silly exhilaration he could exude at night, that they listened to his implorings and discussed them in their godly homes, that they watched the murder of my daughter with approval. The bargain was simple, or so he believed, or so his troops believed. Kill the innocent girl in return for a change in the wind, take her out of the world, use a knife on her flesh to ensure that she would never walk again into a room or wake in the morning, deprive the world of her grace. And as a reward, the gods would make the wind blow in her father's favour on the day he needed wind for his sails. They would hush the wind on the other days when his enemies needed it. The gods would make his men alert and brave and fill his enemies with fear. The gods would strengthen his swords and make them swift and sharp. When he was alive, he and the men around him believed that the gods followed their faith and cared about them, each of them. But I will say now that they did not, they do not. Our appeal to the gods is the same as the appeal a star makes in the sky above us before it falls. There's a sound we cannot hear, a sound to which even if we did hear it, we would be fully indifferent. The gods have their own unearthly concerns, unimagined by us. They barely know we are alive. For them, if they were to hear of us, we would be like the mild sound of wind in the trees, a distant, unpersistent, rustling sound. I know that it was not always thus. There was a time when the gods came in the morning to wake us, when they combed our hair and filled our mouths with the sweetness of speech and listened to our desires and tried to fulfill them for us, when they knew our minds and when they could send us signs. Not long ago, within our memories, the crying women could be heard in the night, time before death came. It was a way of calling the dying home, hastening their flight, softening their wavering journey to the place of rest. My husband was with me in the days before my mother died. We both heard it, and my mother heard it too, and it comforted her that death was ready to lure her with its cries. That noise was stopped. There is no more crying like the wind. The dead fade in their own time. No one helps them. No one notices except those who have been close to them during their short spell in the world. As they fade from the earth, the gods do not hover over with their haunting, whistling sound. I notice it here, the silence around death. They have departed, the ones who oversaw death. They have gone and they will not be back. I went out and looked at the sky, and all I had then to help me was the leftover language of prayer. What had once been powerful and added meaning to everything was now desolate, strange, with its own sad, brittle power, with its memory locked in its rhythms of a vivid past when our words rose up and found completion. Now our words are trapped in time. They are filled with limits. They are mere distractions. They're as fleeting and monotonous as breath. They keep us alive, and maybe that is something, at least for the moment, for which we should be grateful. There is nothing else. And what's interesting about this story, if you're a novelist now, is that we really don't know much about Orestes. I mean, he's the one who murders his mother, so that in turn, this woman, Clytemnestra, just been speaking, is murdered by her own son. But it's Electra who gets all the best lines. Orestes is away somewhere. She's waiting for him to return. But where is he? What's happening to him? What's his story? What's going on in his mind? And it's a sort of gift in a way to a novelist because you can start imagining it. And so in this novel, I started imagining where he was taken. He was rescued. I mean, in other words, his mother just didn't want him in the palace while she was murdering his father, which I think is fair enough. You can see the point of that. And then he's kidnapped, and then he escapes from there with two other boys, and then they're rescued in turn by an old woman who protects them for many years. And then eventually they come home. And Orestes, in my version, is not a hero. He's not a leader. He has no strategy. His sister has strategy. His mother has strategy. His mother's lover has plenty of strategy. But he has none. He's just innocent, passive. He moves between one and the other. He's never sure. He cannot read the signs. He tries to follow the rumors and the whisperings, what's going on. But he's easily led. He's not a leader. And eventually, egged on by his sister and by other events that occurs, he ends up murdering his mother. And he murders her on the way down to her garden. And the problem I had then was, I mean, what do you do next in a novel? He's not a psychopath, and this is not a thriller. So you can't just get on, you can't have the police arrive, because there are no police. I mean, they are there. And so I read through all the possibilities of him going back to his room, of having dinner, meeting his sister, wishing he hadn't done what he did, glad that he had done, happy, content, proud, suddenly a warrior, hero. But none of that would work. The opposite always seemed as true as what I was thinking of suggesting. So one of the things I realized was how much Shakespeare took from this story. Mm-hmm. That, for example, you can see moments of it in Macbeth, the whole idea of the killing of the king, in Coriolanus, but especially in Hamlet, where here is Orestes. He has returned home. His father has been murdered. His mother has taken a lover. And he's wandering uneasily in the palace. And so Once I began to think about that, I realized that one of the things that makes Hamlet work so well is, Hamlet is full of, he's fully in the world. He's got ideas. He's ready to procrastinate, change his mind, be playful, make jokes, just put things off. He's constantly living. He's almost our contemporary, but this is heightened, I think, and made more real in the play by the fact that he has seen his father's ghost. And his father's ghost has spoken to him, so that somehow or other he has been connected to an earlier world, a world of superstition, almost a medieval world. And it just makes his modernity all the more, in a way, dramatic. And so I realized that I could bring a ghost into this book. So I had brought the ghost earlier, because Electra has to do something now that I have sort of reduced her slightly, because I've had enough of her. That she's visited by the ghosts of her father, Agamemnon, and her sister Iphigenia, but they really don't remember how they died. They want something else from the world that they've come back to. Something that can't be easily named, but it's not revenge. And so too, in the case of Clytemnestra, she has a vague memory of how she was killed, but it's only vague. She also has a vague memory of her mother, as Leda, and the whole idea of her mother being raped by a swan. But all of that is vague. And so this is the last bit I'm going to read, and this is the ghost of Clytemnestra. In other words, you turn the page, she's been murdered by her son, and there's a gap of 2 pages, and then you go back, and it's her again. But she's speaking from the dead. There will come a time when the shadows fold in on me. I know that. But I'm awake now, or almost awake. I remember some things, outlines come to me, and the faint sound of voices. What linger most are traces of people, presences, sounds. Mostly I walk among the shades, but sometimes a hint of someone comes close, someone whose name I once knew, or whose voice and face were real to me. Someone I once loved, perhaps, I'm not sure. There's one remnant that comes and persists, however. It is my mother. At some moment in the distant past, she is helpless, being held down. I can hear cries, her cries, and the shriller cries of a figure above her, or lying on her, and then louder cries as the figure flits away. A figure with a beak and wings, with the shape of wings, the wings beating in the air, and my mother lying breathless, whimpering. But I do not know what this means, or why it comes to me. I feel that if I remain still, something more will come. It is hard not to wander in these spaces when there is silence. There are presences I wish to encounter, presences that are close but not close enough to touch or be seen. I cannot think of their names, and I cannot see faces clearly, although there are moments when I have been quiet, when I have made no effort for some time to remember or focus, moments when a face approaches, the face of someone I have known, but it fades before it becomes anyone I can recognize. I know that there was feeling, and that is the difference between where I am now and the place I was once. There was a time, I know, when I felt rage and I felt sorrow. Now I have lost what leads to rage and sorrow. Maybe the only reason I wander in these spaces has to do with some other feeling, or what is left of it. Maybe that feeling is love. There is someone whom I love still, or have loved and protected, but I cannot be sure of that. No name will come. Some words come, but not the words I want, which are the names. If I can say the names, I will know them. Then, I will know then whom I loved, and I will find them, or know how to see them. I will lure them into the shadows when the time is right. No one in their world knows how little there is here. It is all blankness, strangeness, silence. Hardly anything moves. There are echoes like distant water flowing under rock, and then sometimes that sound comes nearer, but it is still faint. If I listen too eagerly, it disappears. Maybe there are things that did not come to an end when I was there, and they linger now like words that need to be said, or words that have escaped me and will come, or might come, or must come, as I wait here. It will take time. I do not know how much time I have or how much time there is. But I know that I must fade, that I cannot persist in this state. Fading will be gradual. By the end I will not know anything. What I'm hoping for is one more surge, some hours or even moments when I will go back into the world and settle into it briefly, as though I were alive. In the meantime, there's memory, which connects and attaches and withdraws. It is always something. A vague thought hovers, but is never stable. Like a figure with wings that edges towards what has been or was. I live on the inside of what has substance. I can feel some large set of pressing desires brushing past. All I'm left with, though, are the grey traces, the clues. This must be what shadow is like, or aftermath, some lines or shapes that must have made sense at one time or may still make sense, but seem random now. If only I could follow what their intention was, or whisper to whoever made them. The desire is the closest I have come to pure feeling, and it is not close at all. I'll be left here for the hours or days or years I have been allotted, no longer than that. Being perplexed and bewildered replaces truth and knowledge, replaces what is real and tangible. The space I inhabit is like a sad gift that was offered and will soon be withdrawn. And then a word occurred to me, a word of which I was sure. It was the word dream. Once the word came, I knew what dream was or had been. And I was certain then that I was not dreaming in this nullness, that none of what is happening is dream, it is real, it is actual. And then other words appeared like stars in the darkening sky. I became desperate to take possession of each one, but I could not hold on to them. They were falling or glittering or moving further away. It was enough, however, to have seen them, to get some idea of their power, and know that some of them would return, and like the light from a full moon on a dark night, become part of a shadowy stability that was guiding me. I walked in the corridors of that palace where I had once lived. I could almost remember some things that had happened. There was an image of someone in a garden or on steps that led to a garden, staring hard, breathing hard, but then nothing. Just stillness in the garden. And then there was not even a garden, there was just merely a space. But I was still awake. I was waiting, knowing that there would be change, that it would not always be like this. I was aware how easy it would be, once I was in those corridors again, for one of the guards to notice me if I made a sound or if I moved quickly, so that there would be some disturbance in the air. And then, slowly, I began to understand why I was here and who I was looking for. His name did not come to me, and I was not able to picture his face, but I felt that he was close. I could imagine the guard who had seen me, or who had noticed my presence, consulting one of the other guards, and then both of them approaching him, the one I'm searching for, or his friend who looks after him. My husband is dead, and my daughter. They have become pure shade. My other daughter is here, but the one I'm searching for is my son. I'm awake, the words I knew are sleeping. Sometimes they turn in the night or make some sound in their vast dreaming, and then they wake too. Often, if only for a second, they open their eyes and watch me. I hold their gaze so that they might remember me as they fall back into sleep. I study them then in their inert state. I'm alert to any movement they make. I can hear their dark groanings in the night, intermittent against their breathing. I can see them reach their arms towards me to be lifted. I can tell the difference between night and day now. I know the silence that descends on the gardens and corridors at night, a silence broken only by the soft movements of the guards or cats. This is my realm where I'm free to wander. As I come from the garden, I'm aware the guards can feel a movement in the air. It would just take one more thing to let them know that I'm with them, a sound, a darting gesture. When the time came, I knew that I would hear his name. My son's name, enough to whisper it like someone imploring. It would come to me when I needed it. Orestes, I whispered on one of those nights, and then I withdrew into the shadows. Orestes, I repeated, letting my voice echo down the corridor. I saw two of the guards running back and forth, and then summoning the other one, my son's friend, who strutted up and down, checking doorways and corners. I waited until he had gone, and then I whispered to one of the guards, "Tell Orestes that I'm his mother. He must come alone into the corridor. He must be alone." The guard made as though to run, but then stopped himself. "Speak again," he said quietly, his head bowed. "Tell Orestes to come alone." I said, "Now?" He asked. "Soon. Orestes must come soon." "Do you mean to cause him harm?" "No, I do not mean to cause him harm." Time for questions? Does anyone have any questions? Do we have a mic? Oh, look. Oh, great.
Hi, Colm. How are you?
Hi.
It's Andrew. Yeah.
Oh, hi.
How are you?
I didn't see you there.
I have a question about language. In some ways, it strikes me that what you've done is also a work of translation in some ways. And I think of Marguerite Yourcenar's Memoirs of Hadrian, the voice for which she started almost during World War II, and put it away because she couldn't quite find it. One of her problems being anachronisms and other things, because she was trying to bring back alive someone from 2,000 years earlier. And it took her 20 years until she was finally, you may know the story, she was on a train to Yale, and suddenly the voice came to her, and she picked up the novel and wrote it straight from that point on. And I wondered how the process was for you to find the right language, essentially, for this book.
I mean, I think the problem was that I didn't want to use any archaic language, but I also could not use contemporary terms. So that it would, I didn't want to bring it up to date linguistically in that way. So that what you're dealing with, for example, that section I just read, is quite a reduced vocabulary. That there are many words you simply cannot use, and even phrasal verbs that you simply cannot use. So you're either in this sort of heightened, heroic sound, or this muted, ghostly sound. But there's a great amount of work that you simply cannot do, and but you have to get the same level of expression and feeling from a reduced vocabulary, and so this involves huge concentration on what exactly the character is feeling, and then trying to find a term for this that is not reading like translatorese. But also is not like a modern sentence, but almost something that the reader won't notice, that won't jar on the ear, and won't attempt to bring the thing up to date to make it even simple for the reader. So it's almost it's really like working with pencil and paper. Before we were working with a lot of acrylic and oil, but you're trying to get exactly the same amount of. I'm thinking about somebody whose work means a lot to me is the painter Leah Selmans, who tends to work only with the night sky and the sea. And she often does cobwebs, and she often does boulders or the desert, but you're working with a very limited vocabulary, visual vocabulary, and you're attempting, however, to do as much as Robert Rauschenberg, can do with all the objects at his disposal. And so with that, there's a composer, Webern, that was really helpful in the sense that his string quartets tend to be about 3 minutes long, or there's very little going on. Then you realize the intensity of what's there. So I was working something like that. I mean, with that opening section I read, I was getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning to do it. It was very much written in the middle of the night with no one else awake, Before anything gets delivered, that hour, there's a Bergman calls it the hour of the wolf, just simply in the middle of the night, trying to reproduce that feeling. But then with that section I just read now, I wrote that in a day or maybe 2 days. It was as though all the rest of the book was building up to the idea that I would let Clytemnestra speak one more time in that tone, sort of muted tone, after she died. But it isn't. It isn't a work of translation in a way. It's a work of imagination, and I let myself free absolutely anytime I wanted to put in anything else I wanted, from borrowing from Shakespeare, from Irish mythology, from imagination, anywhere I wanted to go. I didn't feel constrained in any way by the originals, but the originals for sure were helpful. When in doubt, just go back to Euripides, go back to Aeschylus and Sophocles, and you find an image, a small image, that you can then expand on. And some of the translators have done remarkable work on that.
Thank you.
How did you come up with your title? I'm looking at House of Names, and you have this very complex story.
What happens is that Orestes, when he finally finds someone to protect him, some of his two friends, they find an old woman at the edge of the sea. And I'm working out of Irish mythology to some extent, because the dogs come. She's been protected by dogs, and they kill her dogs. And that is Cuchulainn in Irish mythology, where he kills the guard dog of a man. The man says, "Oh, I've no one to guard me now." He says, "I will be your guard dog." And that's what they say to her, "We will guard you." And so they stay with her. And but they realize slowly that there are huge numbers of people missing from this house. It isn't as though she's always been alone here. And she said, "Well, all the men went to the war, and the others all fled, but they couldn't take me because I'm too frail. So they left me behind." She said, "This was House of Names." And once again, I'm back with the Irish John Millington sings Riders to the Sea, where at the end of the play, when all her sons have been killed, all of them have been drowned, she starts to name them all. And so that whole idea of any old space, any old house, being a house where there were so many names being called, names being used, names, certain rooms belong to certain people who had names, so that idea of that the palace itself and the old woman's house were houses of names. It's the names of John, or the names echo, or the names of residence. So that's the title.
I was absolutely spellbound by the way you read your prose, and to me it sounded like poetry. And so I'm curious to know if you also write poetry.
I do. I'm not very good. So don't encourage me. But I was really helped with this book by the poetry of Louise Blick, who has taken on some very personal subjects, but also classical subjects. But sometimes has managed to mix the two, but has used a particular tone. And I came across her work, I think in 2006 for the first time, but especially a long poem called The Wild Iris, but other poems by her too. It's Gluck, but I found that really enabling and helpful in trying to write those sentences which have their own little rhythm built into them. If I tried to do that in poetry, it wouldn't work, I don't think. But I tried to do it just to graft on a style that included the sentence being a sentence of rhythm in the sentence, onto voice, or in other cases, onto adventure, just to keep that rhythm going. So I had it in my head as a sort of rhythm, which is that has an iambic base to it, that takes its roots from poetry.
Thank you so much for that. It was just gorgeous to listen to. I have a comment. This seems to be some material of the heaviest type, and the words that you use are some of the words that kept leaping out at me, or some of the lightest words. For example, you say that gods hear only their own winds, and Agamemnon sails, that words hasten flight, that of course the beating of the wings in the air, and that the whisper in the air makes a name or naming, and then Clytemnestra says to hold stars in the air, and there's all this movement in the air, and then she says her prayer falls dully like the monotony of breath, and so much of the air is there in this really dense myth, and I wonder if you'd comment on the metaphor that you used there.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to use imagery that was essential in some way or other to do with either the body. I mean, the idea of breath as monotonous. In other words, it has a monotone. I mean, the pulse has a monotone, and that or from the sky, or from trees, or from something absolutely basic. I mean, from just five or six things: birds, trees, sky, moon, star, and just stick to them, and just see what I could do every time that I need something. Could I get the wind rustling in the trees to do something for me? And because I just didn't want it to go any further than that. That I wanted something absolutely elemental.
Yeah, well, air.
Air, yes, and the idea constant of sound, whispering sound, disturbance in the air, someone going by, no one being quite sure who it is, of those things being there. Because I suppose I wanted, again, to keep that idea of black and white, or also not to use too much colour, because of course the thing that is going to be colourful is going to be the blood. And you always want that to be a stark thing, rather than reveling in adventure, or reveling, being excited by the entire business of the violence, of trying to find something opposite to the violence that was stable in the world, and sort of work with that.
Thank you so much. I teach ancient Greek literature, and
Yeah, I was hoping one of the scholars would.
And I'm looking forward to bringing this book to many mid students at UCSB. I think they'll love it. So it'll be wonderful to teach us alongside Greek tragedy. But my question is about something that classicists are facing at the moment. There's a lot of criticism within the humanities of turning back, of going back to Greek literature, of moderns who go back to Greek literature. It's Greek tragedy again. It's culturally imperialist. Why are we turning back to Greek tragedy rather than looking at pre-Columbian myth or Hispanic material? And your lecture gave us a different kind of genealogy of the importance of Greece to Irish writers. But I wondered if you have faced that criticism yourself, and if so, whether you have any further reflections on it.
Well, I do, where you can turn it very easily on its head, especially in dealing with the pre-Columbian material. For example, I'm absolutely aware that if I could, if I just did a few months' work and connect what I've been saying to Mexico without any difficulty, with the whole idea of modern Mexico emerging from an idea of an ancient culture and in a way, you have to make many leaps and the lines are dotted, but nonetheless it really matters. If you wander in Mexico City into that Museum of Archaeology and you watch Mexican school children being told about it, you realize they're being told, this is who you are. This is the greatness of your culture. You come from somewhere very pure and that is almost intact. In other words, it's all collected here and it's in many ruins throughout your country. And don't let anyone tell you that being Mexican means anything other than this. And I think this matters a lot. I mean, despite the poverty, despite the degradations, despite what else has happened in contemporary Mexico, that remains something very important, as it does in Peru. And it's something that is oddly missing, say, in Argentina, where you have something else going on, but that any country who had to emerge from an empire used the ancient past in all sorts of strange ways, and sometimes they really had to, make it match the space they wanted. But that the emergence of the modern Greek state in relation to ancient Greece is one of the ways to look at this. But there's also the idea that it isn't as though we need to be exclusive. That in other words, I can connect this in my own head so easily with the Irish gods, with the warriors, with the ancient texts, that I can bring Colm into this story without any problem. So I think anyone working, for example, with pre-Columbian myth, with for example, even anyone working in China, with what would be ancient Chinese belief, etc. I don't think you would have a problem connecting. But we can't connect all the time. We have to make distinctions as well as connections. And one of the distinctions we have to make is that these plays are the great miracles of Western civilization. And we live, whether we like it or not, within a world that has been so nourished by Western civilization. It's been nourished by many other civilizations too, but surely that idea of Plato, the Republic, of even the Aristotle itself, the idea of the jury system, of the city-state. There's so many things that matter to us. Even say, if you want to look at, there are a lot of things said about Washington D.C., but the architecture, the way in which the column is used, the way in which architectural space, ceremonial architectural space is used in America, has certainly Greek echoes, if not definite connections. And so we can't just, we had to announce one morning that we are giving up on this, without knowing it in full, teaching it regularly, everybody having it on their fingertips, then to say, and we also want to connect to several other things, for example, such as Native American culture, as First Peoples culture. If you're in Canada, that in other words, there are many, you don't have to be exclusive, but you can't throw it out. And so I'm so glad that you're teaching it. And also, I bet you it's true, isn't it, that students are really inspired by it. That people go around thinking that they are electric. You know what I mean? That people think, oh, that's exactly what happened to me. That there are so many connections you can make. I wouldn't make too many obvious ones, but I just mean those people. When we want to talk about, and when Freud wanted to talk about, dissension within a family, he had no difficulty with Oedipus complex. It's a bit strong. You want to be killing your father and sleep with your... No, hold on a minute. But that those words, Oedipus, Electra, actually matter in psychoanalysis, because we can use them as metaphors. But they remain very, very powerful, as any set of myths do. And if we want to live in a society without our myths, then we don't know where we came from, and then we're stuck. Does that make any sense to you?
And then time.
Thank you for this electrifying lecture. Stunning. And also for the electrifying way you tell about your own process. so I hope I might be pardoned a slightly frivolous question. I love the interview that you gave a couple of years ago to the New York Times on their Sunday edition. You were asked all these questions about books and how you feel about them. And you said that when summer rolls around every year, you try to read a small book a day. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to share with us, not all 60 or 90 of them, but 3 or 4 that you're looking forward to reading this summer, and why?
Well, there would be, I suppose, The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. There's an Irish writer called John McGahern, that's McGahern, and there's a long story at the end of his collected stories called The Country Funeral. And it's an absolutely wonderful story. I think it's one of those perfect stories called The Country Funeral by John McGahern, and Haji Murad by Tolstoy. And they're just some examples. I mean, I could go on.
Well, as much as we would love to have you go on, I do know that many of us are eager to have a book signed or to purchase a book and have it signed. And so I wanted to just say on behalf of everyone in this room what a deep pleasure it was to have you here. So if you want to have a book signed, we'll be in the bookstore.
Well, I got to get ready now. I did, you know. Sorry. You know, I was in the shop. They go up quite a bit. And so I found some broken glass and if I afford a clutch, then yes, I was coming to help you know, he's like, I guess because she's probably on the warpath before you die, so she doesn't want that was really
Put yourself out of the wind asking him what he would recommend. Just see the sparkle in his eye.
Mary Nora. At every important occasion I see you. You know that Mary's husband was an art historian. Henry Nora. Mary, these are colleagues of mine. This is a colleague from Italian departments, UCLA and UCSB. That's right, Mary, and your husband was, of course, he was a famous art historian and in his history, you know. So you have much in common. For your 2 novels. Oh my God. This fellow here? Oh, okay. Very
You better go get your book signed.
now's your chance. What's that? Oh, thank you. Very nice. Well, lovely to see you. Oh my. Miranda is nothing if not elegant. This is my friends Lucia and John.
Hi, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. This is my mother, Daphne.
Hi, nice to meet you. Yeah.
Did you enjoy the lecture? What? Did you enjoy the lecture? Yes. Okay.
Más o
I
menos.
like the hesitation.
I won't say I understood it.
Okay.
Put in a word.
Well, look who's here, all the way from Lompoc.
How are you?
How are you? Hi. How are you?
All the way from Deleuze, my friend.
I hope you're happy with the election. You worked hard for it.
To bring this up. He didn't work for it at all. He's not allowed to vote in the United States or in England.
I'm just kidding.
Oh, because he was overseas, so he
He's
can't
without
vote in
a
the UK.
voice.
You're disenfranchised.
But you have a very nice suntan.
That attack should probably have been directed at me.
I know, yes, you.
That's from
Yeah,
walking
you
the
got
dog
it,
in the
deserve.
long puff wind.
That's it.
Windburn.
Well, we'll see what this turns into, won't we?
Oh, I don't know.
haven't, I guess you haven't seen any of the 2020 bumper stickers.
No.
Anyway, no.
How old will he be then?
Yeah, I know. Hold that up. Yeah, maybe 85, something
Yeah,
like
really?
that.
What a terrifying thought.
Those are beautiful shoes.
Thank you. There we go. I was talking about
For the
elegant.
first time.
No, they're comfortable.
They are, and they can play with it.
Oh, where did you get them?
From North Star.
Oh.
They're comfort tea. They look wonderful. They're very nice. Very nice summer shoes.
Lovely, lovely.